everyone. First up, I'm glad you can make it out here. Games are awesome, and it's kind of disappointing that there's only 2 games talks at this conference, but here's one of them, and hopefully it's good. My name's Hallock. I'm one of the co-founders at Clay.io. We're building a platform for HTML5 games. So basically, you can think of us as Steam for HTML5. Today, I wanted to talk about the current state of HTML5 for gaming specifically, and I'm going to go into why HTML5, what HTML5 is capable of today, the development process for these games, distribution, and most importantly, monetization. So we're going to start off with why HTML5. You know, it's important to look at what the advantages of a technology are when you're building games with it. We've seen so many developers that have built HTML5 games with the same approach that someone would build a native game. And in effect, they're competing with these native games with nothing additional to offer other than poor performance. So it's important to look at what HTML5 actually gives you and take advantage of that. So the most important thing for that is that you have easily accessible games. You have games that you can jump into right away without having to install them. For example, 2048 was one of these games that spread really well on Facebook. And it was a game that you could jump into right away from your phone without having to install it because it was HTML5. You could click on the link in Facebook, it would open up a web view, and you could play the game right away. A comparison to that would be Flappy Bird, which wasn't an HTML5 game, although it could have been done with HTML5, where it spread really well on Facebook, but to play it, you had to go through the App Store, enter your password, and install it. So in that sense, it was unnecessary friction. And Flappy Bird obviously did really well, and part of that was because of the infrastructure that the App Store added. And HTML5 doesn't have that yet, but that's something that we're actually trying to fix. The other advantage of HTML5 is that it's cross-platform, and this is one that more developers have taken that approach, is that they can build a game once and have it work everywhere. But HTML5 isn't actually the only way to do this. You can do that with Unity and typically get better performance. So it is great to have for HTML5, but if you're just building a game that's cross-platform and that's all it is, then you're competing with native games that typically perform better. So it's important to take into account that it is cross-platform, but also focus on the fact that people can get into that game right away. Another important factor in why HTML5 is great for games is that the development process is quick, and so is testing it and deploying new updates to your game. You can tweak the game. You don't have to wait for it to compile to see your changes, and then you can push that right away to all the users without having to go through the App Store cycle. So performance has always been one of the big knocks on HTML5, and early on, performance was a really big issue. More recently, it's not as much of an issue, and some of the changes in the past year have been huge for improving performance of HTML5. The biggest one of those for games is WebGL, which lets you tap into the graphics card on a phone. WebGL wasn't in iOS for the longest time, and people weren't even sure that they were going to add it. But fortunately, they did add it for iOS 8. So it's actually on 50% of iPhones right now, since iOS 8 is on 50% of iPhones as of today. The other big change that has helped out performance is improved web views. So like I said, since one of the big advantages of HTML5 is that you can get into the game right away, that's always going to happen through a web view. And typically, web views have had poorer performance than the actual browsers on mobile devices. So Safari had a better JavaScript engine than the web view on iOS. And on Android, their web view was always bundled with the operating system, so you couldn't actually get updates for it unless you updated your version of Android. But fortunately, both of those have been fixed. Safari and WebView on iOS 8 are the exact same. They both have great performance. And on Android, the WebView has been unbundled where it'll auto-update, so you get the better performance as Google comes out with it. So there's definitely been very large performance gains. And an example of that is to look at Pixie.js, which is a rendering engine for HTML5. It renders to WebGL, and then it falls back to Canvas, which has poor performance. I'm still using an iPhone 4. So this is a 4-year-old phone. And running the BunnyMark benchmark, which it loads up a bunch of bunnies and sees how much it can do without the frame rate dipping. On my iPhone 4, I was able to get 100 bunnies before it dipped before 60 frames per second, and 300 bunnies before it dipped below 30 frames per second. So that was pretty poor. And then on a Nexus 5, which has WebGL, and still this is a year-old phone that wasn't even the highest-end phone that was out there. On the Nexus 5, it was able to get 7,000 bunnies before dipping to 60 frames, below 60 frames per second, and 13,000 before it dipped below 30 frames per second. So that's obviously a huge boost in performance based on the JavaScript engines getting better and WebGL being added to it, and of course, better CPUs, more memory, all that good stuff. So it's definitely come a long way in the last 4 years and is continually improving. So now that we have decent, pretty good performance for HTML5, we can take a look at how to properly develop a game that has good performance. And the best way is to really use tools that other people have developed. So Pixie.js has been fantastic because that lets you render to WebGL, but if WebGL isn't on that device, so half of iPhones still, it'll fall back to Canvas and still work just fine. And then you've got various game engines that some of them will tap into Pixie, some of them will do their own WebGL to Canvas fallback. So Phaser is a really popular open source one that's come up in the past year and a half or so. That's got a good community around it. There's Cocos 2DX. They've got a JavaScript version of their game engine, and Cocos 2DX is used by a bunch of the top games in China. So they've got a company backing it that has thousands of people working on their games and their engines. So it's a safe bet if you're wanting to go with an HTML5 game engine. Then there's a few more that are more WebGL focused. So you've got Play Canvas and Goo that are focused on 3D games. A lot of those are in a browser, but they're working with stuff on tablets and phones as well. And then there's a different approach where you can cross-compile. So you're not necessarily writing JavaScript to have a game. You're writing C++ and then compiling that to JavaScript. And Mozilla's got a thing called Emscripten that'll do that for you, and it compiles to ASM.js, which is a subset of JavaScript that actually runs quicker. So that's something interesting. They actually ran a Humble bundle this past week where they had a bunch of games that they ran through Emscripten and had these indie games that are HTML5 that you can pay for with the Humble bundle and play right away. And if you want to look at more game engines that are out there, you can just go to HTML5GameEngine.com, and it has some of the top ones there. So now that we have games that are developed and performing well, we can look at distribution, which is obviously the most important part. If you're developing a game, you want to get that game in people's hands. So there are a few ways to do that. One of the ways that we've seen work really well for Clay and for games on Clay is going through web views, and specifically Kik for us. But there's also, you can get your game in the App Store. There's obviously the iOS App Store and Google Play, but there's also the Windows App Store, Firefox OS. There's Tizen that's coming out, so there's a lot of options for that. And then, of course, since it's an HTML5 game, you can have people play it directly in a browser. So there are a lot of game portals out there that take HTML5 games and try and push traffic towards those. So first up, we'll look at Kik. Kik is, like I said, it's been the source of most of our traffic. It's a messaging app for iOS and Android. 40% of US teens are using Kik, and they're using it, they're more engaged with it than they are with Snapchat. So it's got a huge audience, and most people that I talk to have never heard of Kik, and that's because their demographic is teens. But they have 150 million users, and they actually have an HTML5 platform built into it. So they've got their messaging app, and then they have basically an app store where you can find other HTML5 apps and share those with friends. So they've got 150 million users, but only 600 apps in their ecosystem. So it's a really great target for people who are developing a game to get an initial audience. Another one that's really interesting is Firefox OS. The audience isn't really there for that yet. It's not a huge market right now, but they're taking a really interesting approach with how they're growing. They're growing through developing countries and selling really cheap phones. So they've got a $25 phone in India, and that's something that I think can work. And they're building out this HTML5 ecosystem with it. And obviously Mozilla has been great for HTML5, and they're the ones backing that. So I have high hopes for Firefox OS. And you've got the Amazon App Store. They've always been looking for great HTML5 games, and they're definitely willing to feature HTML5 games. It's another huge company that's backing it. They've got the Kindle, the Fire Phone, and they actually have the marketplace baked into their Amazon app. So it's another one of those where it's easier to get your HTML5 game featured than it would be on iOS or Android, but still with a decent-sized audience. Windows App Store is more of the same, where it's a pretty good-sized audience and a lot easier to get your game featured. And they'll accept HTML5 games natively for both tablets and for phones. And then again, back to browsers, you've got all these Flash portals that are out there. So you've got Congregate, Newgrounds, the typical ones that people would go play Flash games at. You can host your HTML5 game there, and you're competing with other Flash games to try and get an audience. And then there's some more HTML5 specific ones. Mobile Web Arcade is one of those by Tresenza. And then there's a really long tail of just all these like thousands of Flash game portals out there that each one isn't going to bring you, hundreds of thousands of players, but each one can bring, 100, 200, and you've got just tons of those out there. So typically what you want to do to get on those is go through a service that distributes your game to all of those, and rather than have to individually contact 1,000 different small Flash portals. And of course, there's iOS and Android. It can be hard to stand out, but it's not impossible. There have been games that could easily have been done with HTML5 that have done well on iOS and Android, and it seems like more recently it's been a lot of those. There's Don't Touch the Black Tile. There's Flappy Bird. There's the Flappy Copter game. I don't know what the actual name of that one is, but it's relatively easy to get your game onto iOS or Android. You can either go through PhoneGap, which is a lot better now since WebGL is on iOS 8, or you can go through Cocoon.js, which they basically map your JavaScript calls to native calls and make your game perform better. And I don't know if anyone from Ludi's in the audience, but you can talk to them if you're interested in Cocoon.js. And there are a few other ways to get distribution. There's Tizen that's coming out. It's backed by Samsung and Intel, so it's an interesting operating system, but it doesn't really have any users yet. There's Ubuntu Phone that is dealing with HTML5 apps, but again, that one doesn't have users yet. There's, of course, Clay. We're always looking for great HTML5 games, and we'll help push traffic to those. And finally, the most important step here is monetization. And this is the one that's not really there for HTML5 yet. The development process is there, the performance is there, distribution is there. Monetization isn't really there yet. What most developers have been doing is the easy model of making money, which is licensing their games. So they'll build these simple games that'll do well on Flash portal type sites, and they'll sell non-exclusive licenses of their game for $500, $1,000 a piece, and they'll sell 5 or 10 licenses per game. That's a model that's easy to do, and it works for indie developers. It's definitely a good source of income, but there's a pretty low ceiling to it. There's also the exclusive route where you can sell an exclusive license of your game, which basically says that this site can use my game, and they're the only ones that can have my game there. And sometimes I've seen deals go for like $20,000, $30,000 for these type of games, which is nice for an indie developer, but long term it's still a pretty low ceiling per game. There's branded games. I know Tresenza has done a lot of those where they'll do games for HBO and Progressive and making basically HTML5 advertisements, advert games. It's a model that worked well with Flash games, and it's working well with HTML5 as well. There's advertising, which is a fairly easy one to do. You just need a lot of distribution. You can get $1, $2 CPM for games on mobile. So you need a lot of distribution to actually make good money with that. And finally, there's in-app payments. And at Clay, we haven't really seen any HTML5 games do well with in-app payments. It's a service that we offer, and games will add it in, but they won't actually sell items in their games. Like no one will actually buy them. So that's something that still needs work, and I think that's the most lucrative way to monetize HTML5 games, but it still needs work. And part of that is the infrastructure. Like on mobile at least, you have to ask for someone's credit card, and it's a pain to type in your credit card to buy an item in a game. So there needs to be that infrastructure like carrier billing on iOS where you just tap a button to buy something. And again, that's something that we're trying to solve with Clay, but we haven't completely solved it yet. So check back with us soon. So just to summarize, HTML5 games, they're ready now. Like the performance is great, the distribution is there. What's not there is monetization, but it'll get there, and it'll get there soon. So it's definitely an exciting time to be working on HTML5 games. So if you need to reach out to me, I'm happy to help with any questions. If you want to send me an email or if you want to come up here after the talk, you can reach me on Twitter, Austin Hallock. And if you think that HTML5 games are great, we're hiring at Clay. We're hiring engineers, so definitely come chat. And that's it. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. No questions? Yeah.
Aren't there places that give you a share of profits, like an advertising revenue?
Sure. So the question was, are there places that give you shares of the profits for advertising revenue? And there are. There's like Booster Media is one. Basically, they take your game. Actually, Booster Media might have changed their model, but they'll take your game, send traffic to it, and take care of all the advertisement stuff, and they'll give you usually 50% of the revenue share. So that falls sort of under the advertising category.
Like a web monetization model is kind of built off of advertising?
Yep. Advertising is definitely the easiest way to go on the web. People aren't used to paying for things yet. People will pay for things on Facebook for Facebook games, but as far as the traditional web goes, with Flash portals, people are used to the ad model.
Is that animation or is that a game?
This is just a basic canvas game. So it's I wanted to make it somewhat interactive of a presentation since we are working with HTML5 games. It's fun. Thanks. Oh yeah.
I would actually really challenge the statement that development, both the development itself and particularly the performance is here if you're considering mobile. And if you're not considering mobile first, then your strategy is not flawed anyway.
No, we're definitely considering mobile first. WebGL is the big thing that makes performance here now. Right, so we're supporting back to Android 2.3, which means a lot of slow Android devices and just a poor operating system, poor web view. And performance for like a 2048 game, Flappy Bird game is perfectly fine on that. If you want to go past that, it's difficult, right? But the actual market share for Android 2.3 isn't that large right now. So it's I think it's there.
But you really don't get decent Android performance until almost 4.4, but at least 4.x, right?
Yeah. I mean, it does depend on the type of game that you're doing. So I guess I should put the asterisk that performance is there for at least old Android for the simpler games, right? For newer Android, you can do a lot more than those simple games, but simple games are definitely there. So like a Flappy Bird game or 2048 game would be perfectly fine on 2.3 is what we've seen. Cool. Well, thanks.